in the basement archives of the Georgia Historical Society. Buried beneath decades of carefully preserved documents about cotton yields and property transfers, there exists a collection of letters that should not exist. They were written in 1851 by three brothers, sons of one of Georgia's most prominent plantation families, and they describe an experience that defies every assumption about power, control, and the institution that defined the antebellum South. These letters were sealed for 142 years, opened only after the last surviving descendant of the family died without heirs, leaving behind a trunk marked with instructions that read simply, "to be destroyed unread." But a university archivist in 1993, following protocol instead of instruction, opened that trunk and discovered something that would force historians to reconsider what they thought they knew about resistance, about fear, and about a man named Malachi Brown. The letters describe 6 months in 1851 when three young men, heirs to a 3,000-acre cotton empire, lived in conditions that transformed them so completely that they could never return to the lives they were meant to inherit. They describe sleeping on dirt floors, eating cornmeal mush from wooden bowls, working from sunup to sundown under the watch of men who decided when they could eat, when they could rest, and whether they would see another day. But these young men were not enslaved. They were white. They were wealthy. And they were the sons of Harrison Vale, who owned 240 human beings and controlled enough political influence to shape Georgia legislation. What happened to those sons, and why it happened, involves a man who spent 15 years planning something that no one believed was possible. A reversal so complete, so psychologically devastating, that it caused the Vale family to abandon their plantation, liquidate their holdings at massive financial loss, and scatter to distant states under different names, never speaking of Georgia again. The official records from 1851 list the plantation sale as resulting from agricultural decline and family illness. But the letters tell a different story. They tell of a man who understood the machinery of slavery better than those who built it, who studied its mechanisms with the patience of someone who knows that knowledge, not violence, is the truest form of power. They tell of Malachi Brown, who never raised a hand against his enslavers, never attempted escape, and never participated in rebellion. What he did instead was far more terrifying to those who depended on the myth that enslaved people were incapable of strategic thinking. He proved that the very system designed to crush human intelligence had instead created minds capable of turning that system into a weapon. Before we discover what Malachi Brown did during those 6 months in 1851, and why his name became something that plantation owners across 3 states whispered with a fear they would never admit publicly, understand that this story was deliberately erased from history. It was buried, sealed away, and marked for destruction because it revealed something that threatened the entire foundation of Southern society. The idea that those deemed property might actually be more intelligent, more strategic, and more capable than those who claimed to own them. Let's uncover what really happened at Vale Plantation, and why what occurred there sent shockwaves through Georgia's planter aristocracy that never fully subsided. Vale Plantation sat in the heart of Georgia's Black Belt, where the soil ran dark and rich, perfect for cotton that made men into millionaires and families into dynasties. The estate had been in the Vale family since 1798, built by Harrison Vale's grandfather with land grants and ambition. By 1851, Harrison Vale himself was 56 years old, a man whose word carried weight in the state legislature, whose business partnerships extended from Savannah to New Orleans, and whose social standing remained unquestioned among Georgia's planter elite. He ran his plantation with what he considered modern efficiency, having read extensively on scientific agriculture and labor management theories. He prided himself on being less brutal than some neighboring planters. though this restraint came not from moral consideration, but from economic calculation. Damaged property was less productive property, and Vail understood that sustained profitability required maintaining his human assets in working condition, that the plantation operated like a small, self-contained world. 240 enslaved people worked the cotton fields during growing season, their labor generating wealth that had built the Vale family's mansion with its columns imported from Italy and furnishings shipped from England. The house stood at the center of the estate, like a white monument to prosperity, surrounded by outbuildings, corridors, workshops, and the endless rows of cotton that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Harrison Vail had 3 sons who would inherit this empire. James, the eldest at 24, had been educated at the University of Georgia and had returned home to learn plantation management under his father's guidance. Edward, 22, had studied law in Savannah before deciding that managing the family estate offered more promising prospects than legal practice. And Thomas, just 20 years old, possessed his father's business instincts combined with an ambition that sometimes made even Harrison uncomfortable. All 3 moved through the plantation with the unconscious confidence of young men who had never known powerlessness, who had been raised to believe their authority was natural, inevitable, and permanent. Malachi Brown had been born at Vail Plantation in 1821, making him 30 years old in the spring of 1851. His mother, whose name appears in plantation records only as Dinah, had been purchased by Harrison Vail's father specifically for breeding purposes. The ledgers note her physical characteristics with clinical detachment: strong build, good teeth, suitable temperament. She had been forced to bear 8 children over 14 years, each one taken from her before their 5th birthday and sold to distant plantations. Malachi's father does not appear in the records at all, his identity considered irrelevant beyond whatever genetic contribution he provided. Malachi himself grew up watching the plantation's machinery from a perspective that few enslavers ever considered. He understood from childhood that every aspect of the system depended on enslaved people believing they had no alternative, no possibility of resistance beyond escape or rebellion, both of which typically ended in death or torture severe enough to serve as warning to others. But Malachi learned something else during those years. He learned that enslavers were not, despite their own mythology, particularly intelligent. They were simply powerful, and they had mistaken power for intelligence so thoroughly that they had stopped questioning their own assumptions. Harrison Vail and his sons moved through their world with absolute confidence in their superiority, never realizing that this confidence created vulnerabilities that a patient, observant mind could catalog and eventually exploit. Malachi watched everything. He listened to conversations between Harrison and his overseers about crop management, labor allocation, and breeding programs. He absorbed discussions about which enslaved families could be separated for sale, which individuals showed signs of potential resistance, and which discipline methods proved most effective for maintaining control. He learned about debt, about market fluctuations, about political relationships that held the planter class together. And he learned about fear, specifically the fears that men like Harrison Vail would never articulate, but that shaped every decision they made by his teenage years. Malachi had developed an unusual skill. He could read, though no one knew it. He had taught himself by watching the overseers' children during their lessons, by memorizing the shapes of letters and words, by practicing in secret using charcoal on scraps of wood that he would immediately destroy. This literacy gave him access to a world that was supposed to remain forever closed. He read Harrison Vail's correspondence when sent to deliver messages. He read ledgers when tasked with cleaning the plantation office. He read newspapers left in the quarters by careless overseers. Each piece of information became part of a vast mental map that Malachi was constructing. a map of how the plantation system actually functioned beneath its surface mythology, that by 1850. Malachi had been working in various capacities around the plantation for 14 years. He had labored in the cotton fields, worked in the stables, served in the main house, and assisted in the plantation workshops where enslaved craftsmen produced the tools, barrels, and goods that kept the estate running. This movement between different areas of plantation life was unusual and happened only because Malachi had developed a reputation for competence that made him valuable in multiple roles. Harrison Vale considered him one of the plantation's most reliable workers, a man who required minimal supervision and who seemed to accept his circumstances with a resignation that Vale found appropriately submissive. Vale had no idea that this resignation was performance, that behind Malachi's downcast eyes and deferential posture existed a mind that had been analyzing the plantation's vulnerabilities for 15 years, building a plan so methodical, so comprehensive, that when executed, it would dismantle everything the Vale family had built. The catalyst came in March of 1851, when Malachi's wife Sarah, whom he had married in one of the plantation's informal ceremonies that carried no legal weight, but created bonds that even the brutal logic of slavery could not entirely destroy, was sold to a plantation in Alabama. The decision was purely financial. Harrison Vale needed capital to expand his cotton acreage, and Sarah had value that could be converted to cash. The separation was executed with the casual efficiency that characterized such transactions. Sarah was given 1 hour to prepare, no opportunity to say proper goodbyes, and was then placed in a wagon with 3 other people being sold to the same buyer. Malachi watched her disappear down the plantation road, watched until the wagon became a speck and then nothing, and something that had been held carefully in check for 30 years finally settled into cold, absolute clarity. He did not rage. He did not grieve visibly. He did not give Harrison Vale or any overseer the satisfaction of seeing his devastation. Instead, Malachi went back to his work with the same mechanical efficiency he had always shown, and he began implementing the plan he had been developing for years. A plan that required perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and the cooperation of people who had every reason to distrust any scheme that seemed too ambitious. Over the next 6 weeks, Malachi had quiet conversations with specific individuals at Vale Plantation. These were not random selections. Each person he approached had been carefully chosen based on years of observation. Some were enslaved craftsmen whose skills gave them limited mobility around the estate. Others were domestic workers who had access to the main house and knowledge of the Vale family's routines. A few were field workers whose strength and endurance would be necessary for the physical aspects of what Malachi was planning. He spoke to each person individually, never gathering groups that might attract overseer attention, and he presented his plan in pieces, giving each person only the information they needed to perform their specific role. The plan itself was extraordinary in its complexity. Malachi had identified a weakness in the plantation's security that seemed impossible to exploit, but that he believed could be turned into an opportunity. The Vale sons, despite their education and supposed sophistication, followed predictable routines. They hunted in the same forests, rode the same paths, and visited the same locations on the estate at the same times. They moved with the carelessness of people who had never considered that they might be vulnerable, that the landscape they believed they controlled might contain threats they were incapable of recognizing. Malachi had mapped their patterns over years, noting where they traveled alone when they were separated from overseers, and which routes took them through areas where intervention could occur without immediate discovery. But capturing the Vale sons was only the beginning of Malachi's plan, and it was not even the most important element. What Malachi understood, with a clarity that came from living inside the system for 30 years, was that physical control alone would accomplish nothing meaningful. The Vale sons could be held briefly, returned safely, and the plantation would continue operating exactly as before, probably with increased security and brutal reprisals against anyone suspected of involvement. No, what Malachi intended was psychological reconstruction. He planned to make the Vale sons experience slavery, not as observers or temporary victims, but as a lived reality that would destroy their ability to comfortably participate in the system that had created them. He would not hurt their bodies. He would reconfigure their understanding of themselves and their world so completely that they could never return to their previous lives. Implementation began on April 14, 1851, a date that would later be referenced in the sealed letters as the day everything changed. James Vale, the eldest son, had ridden out alone to inspect a distant section of the plantation where new land was being cleared for cotton expansion. He followed his usual route through pine forest and fields, confident in his surroundings, never considering that he was being observed by people who had studied his movements with predatory patience. He never saw the rope stretched across the path at neck height. He never identified the figures who moved from the trees after his horse reared and threw him. And he never understood, in those first confused moments, that his life as he had known it had just ended. When James regained consciousness, he found himself in darkness, bound securely, unable to see or call for help through the gag that filled his mouth. He could hear voices, low and measured, speaking around him but not to him, as if he had become an object whose consciousness was irrelevant to whatever was being discussed. The disorientation was total, the fear immediate and overwhelming. For perhaps the first time in his life, James Vale had absolutely no control over his circumstances, no ability to command or negotiate, no access to the authority that had defined his entire existence. And this was exactly what Malachi had intended. This was only the beginning. James Vale remained in that darkness for what felt like days, but was actually 18 hours. During that time, he experienced something that would fundamentally alter his psychological framework. He was moved multiple times, always bound and blindfolded, carried by hands that were neither gentle nor cruel, simply efficient. He was given water, but had to drink awkwardly, unable to use his hands, forced to accept help for the most basic survival needs. He was allowed to relieve himself, but only when his captors decided it was time, and only with assistance that stripped away every shred of dignity he had previously taken for granted. By the time the blindfold was finally removed, James had already begun the process that Malachi intended. He had started to understand, on a visceral level that no intellectual argument could achieve, what it meant to have your body controlled entirely by others, to exist at the mercy of decisions made without your input, to be reduced from a person to a problem that others were managing. When James's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he found himself in a small room, perhaps 10 feet square, with a dirt floor and walls made of rough-cut pine. A single lantern provided illumination, and standing before him, calm and utterly composed, was Malachi Brown. James recognized him immediately. Malachi had served in the main house on occasions, had been present at family meals as part of the serving staff, had existed in that peripheral space where enslaved people performed their functions, while remaining somehow invisible to those they served. But now, seeing Malachi in this context, James felt a shock of recognition that went beyond simple identification. He was seeing, truly seeing, another human being for perhaps the first time in his life. Not as background, not as function, but as a person whose intelligence and capability were suddenly, terrifyingly apparent. Not Malach, I spoke with perfect diction, his voice carrying none of the dialectical patterns that enslaved people typically used when addressing white people. This, too, was deliberate. Malachi was stripping away every comfortable assumption James had ever made. "Mr. Vale," Malachi said, and the formal address carried weight because it suggested a relationship between equals, something James's entire worldview insisted was impossible. You are going to live here for the next 6 months. Your brothers will join you shortly. During this time, you will experience what it means to be property. You will work when told to work, eat what you are given when you are given it, and sleep where you are directed to sleep. You will have no control over your time, your body, or your future. You will learn what 240 people at your family's plantation have known their entire lives. And when these 6 months conclude, you will be returned to your father, physically unharmed but fundamentally changed. This is not negotiable. This is not punishment. This is education. James tried to speak, tried to argue or threaten or negotiate, but Malachi raised a hand and the words died unspoken. Your father knows you are missing, Malachi continued. He is currently searching the plantation and the surrounding county. Tomorrow, he will receive a message explaining that you are safe and that you will be returned if he meets certain conditions. Those conditions include his complete silence about your disappearance and his cooperation with instructions he will receive periodically. If he alerts authorities, if he organizes armed searches, if he does anything except cooperate fully, you will never be seen again. Not because we will harm you, but because you will be transported through networks that move people like merchandise from Georgia to Texas, where you will be sold to work camps under a new identity. Your father understands property transfer. He will understand this threat. The genius of this approach would become clear in the following days, when Edward and Thomas Vale were captured through similar methods and brought to join their brother. The 3 sons found themselves confined together in a modified building that existed in a blind spot on their own plantation, a structure that enslaved craftsmen had altered over months in ways invisible to overseer inspection. The building sat in a dense section of trees between the quarters and the fields, positioned such that the daily movements of enslaved workers provided both cover and surveillance. Anyone approaching from the wrong direction would be seen long before they could discover what the building contained. The Vale sons, imprisoned on their own property, surrounded by people who knew exactly where they were, remained as effectively disappeared as if they had been transported 1,000 miles away. The first week of their confinement established the psychological framework that would define the next 6 months. The brothers were awakened before dawn, given bowls of cornmeal mush and water, and then taken to work in fields that had been deliberately left partially unharvested from the previous season. The work was backbreaking, clearing brush and stumps, preparing ground that would supposedly be planted with cotton. But the actual agricultural purpose was secondary to the real goal. The Vale sons were experiencing physical labor under supervision, being told when to work and when to rest, having their water breaks controlled by others, and slowly, methodically learning what it felt like to be directed rather than to direct. Malachi had assigned specific people to oversee the brothers, and these assignments were not random. Each overseer was someone who had personal experience with the brutality of the Vale family's plantation management. There was Samuel, whose wife had been sold away 3 years earlier to settle a debt. There was Marcus, who bore scars across his back from a whipping ordered by James Vale himself after a cotton quota was missed. There was Elizabeth, a woman whose daughter had been taken from her at age 7 and sold to a plantation in Mississippi, never to be seen again. These people did not abuse the Vale sons. They did not beat them or starve them or subject them to torture. Instead, they treated the brothers with exactly the same casual indifference that the brothers had shown to enslaved people throughout their lives. When James complained about the food, Samuel responded with the same tone James had used countless times when dismissing complaints from enslaved workers. You'll eat what you're given and be grateful for it. When Edward protested that the work was too demanding, Marcus replied with words that Edward himself had spoken to field workers. This plantation doesn't run on excuses. The work gets done or you don't eat. When Thomas tried to negotiate better conditions by promising rewards once he was freed, Elizabeth looked at him with an expression that contained no anger, just a kind of tired patience, and said something that would haunt Thomas for the rest of his life. You think promises from a master mean anything to property? That's the first thing you need to unlearn. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The brothers had always understood slavery as an abstract economic system, justified by theories about racial hierarchy and civilizational superiority. They had read philosophical treatises defending the institution, heard sermons explaining its biblical foundations, and absorbed cultural narratives that presented enslavement as a natural condition for people deemed inferior. But experiencing powerlessness, even in this controlled context, dissolved those abstractions with devastating efficiency. Within days, James stopped trying to command. Edward stopped expecting his words to carry automatic authority. Thomas stopped believing that his family name meant anything in circumstances where power operated through different channels. By the second week, something even more significant began to happen. The brothers started to see the enslaved people around them as fully human in ways they had never managed before. When Marcus supervised their work, they noticed his intelligence in how he allocated tasks and managed time. When Samuel explained agricultural techniques, they recognized sophisticated knowledge they had always assumed belonged exclusively to educated planters. When Elizabeth spoke about her own life, they heard stories of love, loss, ambition, and resilience that matched anything they had experienced in their own supposedly superior existence. The revelation was not gentle. It came with shame, with the crushing recognition that they had lived their entire lives surrounded by people whose humanity they had systematically denied, because that denial was necessary for their own comfort. Meanwhile, Harrison Vale was experiencing his own form of psychological devastation. The message he received on the second day of his son's disappearance explained the situation with brutal clarity. His sons were alive and would remain so if he cooperated. That cooperation required absolute silence about what had occurred, continued operation of the plantation as if nothing were wrong, and adherence to instructions he would receive periodically. The message had been delivered by a trusted house servant, someone who had worked for the Vale family for 20 years, and whose loyalty Harrison had never questioned. Discovering that this person was part of a network sophisticated enough to capture his sons and hold them successfully shattered Harrison's understanding of his own plantation. He had believed he controlled Vale Plantation completely, that his authority extended into every corner of the estate. Now he understood that an entire parallel structure existed beneath his awareness, organized by people he had dismissed as incapable of complex planning. Harrison's initial instinct was to ignore the warnings and organize armed searches, to use his authority and connections to crush this rebellion through overwhelming force. But the message had anticipated this response and addressed it directly. Any attempt to seek outside help would result in his sons being transported via underground railroad networks, but moving south instead of north, into the brutal labor camps of East Texas, where men worked until they died and where questions about identity were never asked. Moreover, the message explained that comprehensive documentation of Vale Plantation's operations, including details of breeding programs, family separations, and discipline methods that violated even the minimal legal protections theoretically afforded to enslaved people, had been compiled and would be sent to abolition societies in Boston and Philadelphia if Harrison did not cooperate. The social and legal consequences would destroy everything Harrison had built. He was trapped by the same mechanisms he had used to trap others. The threat of separation, the fear of losing family permanently, the knowledge that loved ones existed somewhere beyond reach, subject to conditions he could not control. For the first time in his life, Harrison Vale understood what he had done to hundreds of people over decades. And that understanding brought no comfort, no moral awakening, only terror and rage that he had to suppress, because any expression of either would endanger his sons. Further, the instructions Harrison received over the following weeks were designed to deepen his complicity and his helplessness. He was told to reduce work quotas for certain enslaved individuals, to improve food rations slightly, to allow additional rest periods. These changes, small enough to avoid drawing attention from neighboring planters, but significant enough to improve conditions meaningfully, forced Harrison to participate in undoing his own system. He was told to review his breeding program ledgers and select 5 families who would not be separated for sale, regardless of financial pressures. He was required to draft letters to business associates, explaining that he was reconsidering some plantation management practices for efficiency reasons. Each instruction made Harrison an active participant in limiting his own power, made him complicit in constraining the very authority he had spent his life building. But the most psychologically devastating instruction came in the 3rd week. Harrison was told to visit a specific location on his plantation at midnight, alone, where he would be permitted to see his sons briefly. He followed the directions exactly, walking through darkness to a clearing he had not known existed, despite owning this land for decades. There, illuminated by moonlight and a single lantern, he saw James, Edward, and Thomas. They stood together, dressed in the rough clothing of field workers, their hands showing blisters and calluses from labor, their faces carrying expressions he had never seen before. Something in them had already changed. They looked at their father with a mixture of emotions he could not fully parse, but among those emotions he recognized something that made him cold. They looked at him with understanding, with a kind of sympathy, as if they had learned something about him that he did not know about himself. The brothers were not permitted to speak during this brief meeting. Malachi stood nearby, ensuring the encounter remained controlled. But James managed to make eye contact with his father and nod slightly, a gesture that somehow communicated both reassurance and distance. Harrison wanted to reach for his sons, to embrace them, to assert the family bonds that should transcend any circumstance. But something in their posture and the way they held themselves suggested that the people standing before him were not quite the same people who had disappeared weeks earlier. They were being reconfigured by experience into something their father could not yet recognize. As Harrison walked back through darkness to the main house, he experienced something he had never allowed himself to feel before. He felt grief for all the families he had separated, all the parents who had stood as he was standing, watching their children exist beyond reach, unable to protect or comfort or maintain the bonds that should have been unbreakable. The empathy was not noble or redemptive. It came with bitterness and resentment, with anger at being forced to feel something that undermined his entire worldview. But it was real, and it was devastating, and it would not release him from its grip. By the end of the 1st month, the situation at Vale Plantation had developed layers of complexity that no one, including Malachi, had fully anticipated. The brothers were experiencing transformation, but that transformation was creating unexpected problems. They were supposed to learn what slavery felt like, to understand the system's brutality through temporary experience. But they were also developing relationships with their captors that complicated the simple victim-oppressor dynamic that should have defined their situation. Thomas, in particular, had begun having long conversations with Elizabeth during rest periods, conversations about her life, her lost daughter, and her understanding of resistance. These conversations were changing Thomas in ways that extended beyond the immediate educational purpose of Malachi's program. Edward had developed something approaching friendship with Samuel, bonding over shared interests in literature and philosophy that both men possessed, but that the plantation's social structure had never permitted them to explore together. James, meanwhile, had become increasingly silent, withdrawn into contemplation that suggested not just learning, but fundamental psychological restructuring. The brothers were being transformed, but into what exactly remained unclear. They were losing their ability to participate comfortably in the plantation system, but they were also becoming something new, something that did not fit easily into any existing social category. And Malachi himself was experiencing the weight of power in ways he had not fully anticipated. He held absolute authority over the Veil Sons, could determine their conditions, their treatment, their very survival. But exercising that power, even justly, even as education rather than revenge, was revealing itself to be its own burden. He found himself unable to sleep some nights, lying awake and questioning whether what he was doing was actually dismantling the system or simply perpetuating its logic through role reversal. The question had no easy answer, and that uncertainty was beginning to show in small ways that concerned those working with him. The situation was approaching a critical juncture, though no one yet understood exactly what that would mean. The system Malachi had created was working, perhaps too well, producing changes that would soon force everyone involved to confront questions they had not been prepared to answer. The transformation of the Veil brothers reached a critical point in the 8th week when an incident occurred that would force everyone involved to confront the fundamental contradictions. At the heart of Malachi's program, Thomas Veil, while working alongside Marcus in the fields, collapsed from heat exhaustion. The Georgia sun that day was merciless, a kind of heat that made the air shimmer and turned physical labor into a test of endurance that even experienced field workers struggled to pass. Thomas had been pushing himself harder than necessary, working with an intensity that seemed driven by something beyond simple compliance with orders. When he fell, Marcus immediately called for water and shade, responding with the kind of immediate concern that recognized another human being in distress. But this response created a problem that exposed the tension inherent in Malachi's entire approach. If the point was to teach the Veil Sons what slavery actually meant, then Thomas should have been treated with the same indifference that enslaved people often experienced when they collapsed from exhaustion. Many overseers on plantations across the South would have responded to such a collapse with threats, with accusations of laziness, with demands that the person get up and return to work regardless of their physical condition. That was the reality of slavery. That was what needed to be taught. But Marcus could not bring himself to treat another human being that way, even in service of education, even when that person represented everything that had caused his own suffering. He provided water, he ensured Thomas was moved to shade, and he allowed him to rest for as long as needed to recover. When Malachi learned of the incident, he called a meeting with the core group who were implementing his program. They gathered after nightfall in the same modified building where the Veil Sons were confined, though the brothers were kept in their separate rooms during this discussion. The conversation that followed revealed fractures in the group's unity that had been developing beneath the surface for weeks. Samuel argued that they needed to maintain consistency, that any mercy shown to the Veil Sons undermined the educational purpose of the entire program. If they treated the brothers with humanity that enslaved people were routinely denied, then the brothers would never truly understand what slavery meant. They would experience a sanitized version, uncomfortable but tolerable, and they would return to their lives having learned nothing of real value. Elizabeth countered that the entire point was to demonstrate their own humanity, not to replicate the system's brutality. If they treated the Veil Sons with the same cruelty that had been inflicted on them, they would simply be perpetuating the logic of slavery rather than challenging it. The goal should be to show that even when power was reversed, even when those who had been oppressed gained control over their oppressors, they would choose to act differently, would refuse to become the monsters that the system had tried to create. Marcus supported Elizabeth's position, adding that he had not agreed to participate in this program in order to become like the overseers who had brutalized him. He would not sacrifice his own humanity, his own moral principles, simply to make a pedagogical point. Malachi listened to these arguments with visible tension. He understood both positions because he felt the contradiction himself, felt it every day as he maintained this program. He had designed it to be psychologically devastating without physical cruelty, but the line between those two categories was proving harder to maintain than he had anticipated. The psychological weight of powerlessness was itself a form of cruelty, and the fact that it came with adequate food and freedom from physical abuse did not change its essential nature. At the same time, he recognized that replicating the worst aspects of slavery would corrupt everyone involved and would ultimately serve no purpose beyond revenge, which had never been his primary goal. The meeting ended without clear resolution, but with an implicit understanding that they would continue showing the veiled sons more humanity than enslaved people typically received, even if this complicated the lessons being taught. This decision would prove crucial in the weeks that followed, though not in ways anyone anticipated. The Veil brothers, witnessing daily the choice their captors made to treat them with dignity despite having every justification for cruelty, began to understand something more profound than simple fear or suffering could have taught them. They began to recognize the moral superiority of people they had been raised to consider inferior, began to see that humanity was not a quality granted by social position, but something demonstrated through choices made under pressure. By the third month, the brothers were having conversations among themselves during evening hours that would have been unthinkable before their captivity. James, who had always been the most devoted to plantation management and to the theories that justified slavery, admitted to his brothers that he could no longer believe what they had been taught. He described the process of his own mental collapse with the kind of detailed self-awareness that suggested someone who had been forced to examine assumptions previously held beyond question. "I always believed," James said during one of these evening conversations that Thomas would later document in his sealed letter, "that our authority came from natural superiority, that God had established a hierarchy and we simply occupied our rightful place. But these people who hold us now possess intelligence and capability that match or exceed our own. The only difference is power, arbitrary power we were born into and they were born without. And that power does not make us superior. It just makes us lucky and them unfortunate. That's all slavery has ever been. Fortune and misfortune, enforced by violence and justified by lies we told ourselves." Edward, who had studied law and had always prided himself on logical thinking, approached the same conclusion from a different angle. He had been analyzing the structure of Malachi's program with the kind of careful attention he had learned in his legal education, and he recognized something that disturbed him deeply. "This entire program," he told his brothers, "is sophisticated beyond anything I encountered at university. The planning required, the coordination, the psychological insight into how to remake someone's understanding of themselves and their world. Malachi Brown designed and executed something that would challenge the greatest strategic minds. And he did it while enslaved, while working full days in fields and performing whatever labor was demanded of him. That means the intelligence was always there. We just refused to see it because seeing it would have undermined everything." Thomas had been changed most profoundly by his conversations with Elizabeth, specifically by listening to her describe her daughter's sale and her own subsequent years of grief. He tried to explain to his brothers what he had learned, though he struggled to find adequate words. "When she talks about losing her daughter," Thomas said, "the love she describes, the bond that was severed, it is exactly what I imagine our Father feels about us right now. Exactly the same. Which means we have been systematically destroying families whose love was as real as our own, whose grief was as profound as what our Father is experiencing. And we did it casually, as business transactions, because we convinced ourselves those feelings were somehow less real, less significant, when felt by people we had decided to call property. These conversations were overheard by Malachi, who had listening posts established to monitor the brothers' mental states. He listened to these exchanges with complicated emotions. On one level, his program was succeeding beyond what he had hoped. The brothers were not simply learning to fear slavery, but were understanding its fundamental injustice in ways that would make their comfortable participation in the system impossible. But Malachi also recognized that he had created a new problem. What would happen to these young men when they were eventually released? They could not return to plantation management having understood what they now understood. They could not participate in the buying and selling of human beings, in the separation of families, in the enforcement of a system they now recognized as morally indefensible. He had successfully destroyed their ability to be plantation heirs. But he had not provided them with any alternative identity or purpose. This realization forced Malachi to confront questions about the ultimate goals of his program that he had been avoiding. Was the point simply to traumatize the Vale sons, to inflict on them a fraction of what had been inflicted on countless enslaved people? Or was the goal something larger, something that involved transforming them into people who might actually work against the system that had created them? And if the latter, what did that transformation require beyond the education they were already receiving? Meanwhile, Harrison Vale had been implementing the instructions he received with mechanical compliance, but the psychological cost was mounting in ways that were becoming visible to those around him. His wife Margaret noticed that he had stopped sleeping properly, that he spent hours in his study, staring at the breeding ledgers that documented decades of family separations. He had begun to speak differently to the enslaved people at Vale Plantation, his tone carrying an uncertainty that had never been present before. Several overseers remarked privately that Master Vale seemed diminished somehow, less sure of his authority, more hesitant in his commands. The plantation continued to operate. Cotton was still being cultivated and harvested, and outwardly nothing had changed. But something fundamental in Harrison Vale's certainty about his world had cracked, and that crack was widening. The most significant instruction Harrison received during this period came in the 10th week. He was told to select 10 enslaved families at Vale Plantation who would receive written guarantees that they would never be separated for sale, regardless of financial pressures or estate planning needs. These guarantees would be legally binding documents, filed with the county and enforceable by law. Harrison was also instructed to provide each of these families with modest but meaningful improvements in their living conditions, better cabins, additional food rations, and exemption from the most brutal forms of punishment. The instruction came with an explanation that Harrison found more disturbing than any threat. These families, the message read, represent a fraction of those you have destroyed through separation over the years. You cannot restore what was taken from them, cannot reunite parents and children scattered across multiple states. But you can ensure that this specific cruelty does not continue. Consider it tuition for the education your sons are receiving. Harrison struggled with this instruction more than any previous one because it forced him to confront the scope of what he had done over decades. Selecting 10 families meant reviewing records of hundreds of separations, meant seeing in comprehensive detail the children taken from mothers, the husbands sold away from wives, the systematic destruction of human bonds he had authorized with casual signatures and ledgers. The process of selection took him days, and by the end, he had to acknowledge something he had spent his life avoiding. He had been monstrous. Not in the dramatic sense of someone who took pleasure in cruelty, but in the banal sense of someone who had inflicted immense suffering while telling himself it was simply business, simply the way things were done, simply the natural order of an institution he had inherited rather than created. When Harrison finally completed the legal documents, guaranteeing protection for the 10 selected families, he experienced something close to psychological collapse. He called for his wife Margaret, and for the first time in their 32-year marriage, confessed to her the full truth of what was happening. He told her about their son's captivity, about the instructions he had been following, and about the moral reckoning that was being forced upon him. Margaret's response would be documented in her own letters that would be discovered alongside her husband's papers. She wrote that Harrison wept as he spoke, something she had never seen in 3 decades together, and that his tears came not from fear for their sons, but from recognition of what he had done to other sons and daughters across years of plantation management. Before we continue with the final stages of Malachi, Brown's extraordinary program, and discover what ultimately happened to the Vale family, take a moment to consider what you're learning here. These are stories that were deliberately erased from history, accounts that powerful families wanted destroyed because they revealed uncomfortable truths about slavery, about resistance, and about the human capacity for both justice and mercy under impossible circumstances. If this story is affecting you the way it affected those who first uncovered these sealed letters, share this video with someone who values historical truth, even when that truth is difficult. And make sure you're subscribed to The Sealed Room, because we're committed to bringing you stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about American history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss content like this. Now, let's discover how Malachi Brown's program reached its conclusion, and why the resolution he engineered would haunt the Vale family for generations. The 4th month brought a development that no one had anticipated. One of the other major plantation families in the county, the Hendersons, experienced their own crisis when their eldest son disappeared under circumstances eerily similar to what had happened to the Vale brothers. Word reached Malachi through the communication networks that connected enslaved people across multiple estates, and his immediate reaction was alarm rather than satisfaction. His program had depended on controlled implementation, on precise execution within a specific context. If other enslaved people at other plantations were attempting to replicate his methods without understanding the safeguards he had established, the result would be catastrophic violence and mass retaliation that would destroy everything he had worked to achieve. Malachi moved quickly to investigate what had happened at the Henderson plantation. Using the same underground networks that had facilitated his own program, he made contact with the enslaved people who had taken the Henderson son. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. They had heard rumors about Vale Plantation and had attempted their own version of Malachi's program. But without the careful planning, without the documentation that created checkmate situations, and without clear objectives beyond simple revenge, the Henderson situation was escalating toward bloodshed, and once that violence began, it would trigger regional suppression that would make no distinction between Malachi's calculated program and crude improvisation. Malachi faced a choice that would define the final phase of his entire undertaking. He could allow the Henderson situation to develop independently, which would likely end in executions and brutal retaliation, but might also spread fear among the planter class. Or he could intervene, use his influence to de-escalate the Henderson crisis, and in doing so, reveal the extent of the networks he had built and potentially compromise his own program. After consultation with his core group, including long debate about priorities and risks, Malachi made a decision that demonstrated the sophistication of his strategic thinking. He would use the Henderson crisis as leverage to force a larger resolution. Malachi went to Harrison Vale with a proposal that would resolve both the immediate Henderson crisis and the larger question of what would happen when the Vale brothers were eventually released. They met in the plantation office after midnight, and for the first time since this entire program began, they spoke not as master and enslaved person, not even as captor and victim's father, but as two men trying to navigate an impossible situation that had spiraled beyond either of their control. Malachi explained the Henderson situation with clinical precision, making clear that violent suppression was imminent unless someone with authority could convince neighboring planters that the crisis could be resolved peacefully. Harrison had that authority. He had the social standing, the political connections, and the credibility among his peers to argue for measured response rather than mass retaliation. But Malachi's proposal extended far beyond crisis management. He laid out a comprehensive plan that would end his program at Vale Plantation while creating lasting change that would outlive the immediate circumstances. The terms were specific and non-negotiable. First, the Vale brothers would be released, but they would not return to plantation life. They would relocate permanently to northern states, would be provided with sufficient capital to establish businesses unrelated to slavery, and would be required to support abolition work financially for no less than 10 years. They would be permitted minimal contact with their parents during the first 3 years to ensure they established independent identities separate from their plantation heritage. Second, Harrison Vale would use his considerable political influence to advocate for specific reforms in Georgia's slave codes, particularly restrictions on family separation and breeding programs. He would not expose his own practices directly, which would serve no purpose beyond destroying his credibility. But he would argue forcefully that certain plantation management methods created security risks and moral complications that threatened the stability of the entire system. Third, and most significantly, Harrison would quietly facilitate the freedom of 50 enslaved people from Vale Plantation over the next 5 years. Not through dramatic mass emancipation that would trigger legal challenges and community backlash, but through careful, strategic grants of freedom papers that could be legally defended, and that would appear to result from individual circumstances rather than systematic policy. Malachi had prepared a list of specific individuals and families, prioritizing those who had suffered most under the breeding program, those whose children had been sold away, and those whose skills would allow them to build stable lives in free states. Fourth, Harrison would establish a trust fund, disguised as payment for past services, that would provide resources for formerly enslaved people from Vale Plantation, who managed to escape via underground railroad networks. The fund would be administered by Northern abolition societies, and Harrison would maintain plausible deniability about its true purpose while ensuring regular contributions. Finally, Harrison would work with Malachi to peacefully resolve the Henderson crisis by convincing the Henderson family and neighboring planters that negotiation rather than violence served everyone's interests. This would require Harrison to advocate for a position that many of his peers would consider weak or dangerous, but it would prevent the mass executions and brutal suppression that seemed increasingly inevitable. In exchange for Harrison's compliance with all these terms, Malachi would end his program immediately, would ensure that all documentation potentially damaging to the Vale family was secured and would never be released, and would guarantee that no similar programs would be initiated at Vale Plantation or surrounding estates as long as Harrison fulfilled his obligations. Harrison listened to these terms with an expression that shifted between exhaustion, relief, and resignation. He recognized that Malachi was offering him a path out of an impossible situation, but that path required permanent transformation of everything Harrison had spent his life building. He would have to become an advocate for limiting his own power, would have to work against the system that had made his family wealthy, and would have to live with the knowledge that he was complying not from moral awakening, but from strategic defeat. But the alternative, allowing the situation to escalate into regional violence that would likely result in his son's deaths and potentially his own financial and social destruction, was unthinkable. Harrison agreed to Malachi's terms, and in that agreement, both men understood that they had reached not a reconciliation, but a negotiated settlement between parties who would never trust each other, but who, recognized mutual interest in avoiding catastrophe. The implementation of their agreement began immediately. Harrison traveled to neighboring plantations and used his influence to organize a meeting of major landowners in the county. He presented the Henderson situation as an isolated incident that could be resolved through negotiation rather than violence, arguing that mass retaliation would create martyrs, would inspire additional resistance, and would ultimately prove more costly than strategic flexibility. His arguments were pragmatic rather than moral, focused on security and economics rather than justice. Several plantation owners resisted, wanting to make brutal examples that would discourage any future challenges to their authority. But Harrison persisted, leveraging business relationships and political alliances, and eventually convinced enough influential planters that a negotiated resolution served their collective interests. Malachi, meanwhile, worked through the enslaved communication networks to facilitate the Henderson sons' safe return and the relocation of those who had taken him to northern states via underground railroad channels. The operation required careful coordination across multiple plantations and involved risks that could have resulted in captures and executions if any element had failed. But the networks that enslaved people had built over generations, networks that moved information and people with efficiency that slave owners never fully understood, proved equal to the challenge. The Henderson son was returned unharmed. The enslaved people who had taken him disappeared into free states before any retaliation could be organized, and the crisis was resolved without the bloodshed that had seemed inevitable. The Vail brothers were released in the program's 16th week, 2 weeks short of the original 6-month timeline. Their release was structured carefully to ensure they understood that their freedom came with permanent obligations. Malachi met with them one final time before they departed Vail Plantation, and his words to them would be recorded in Thomas's sealed letter years later. "You have experienced a fraction of what 240 people at this plantation have endured their entire lives," Malachi said. "You have learned what powerlessness feels like, what it means to have your body and your time controlled entirely by others. But your education is incomplete and will remain incomplete because you will return to freedom, to resources, to opportunities that enslaved people can never access. What you do with that freedom will determine whether your suffering served any purpose beyond your own discomfort. You can return to the world you came from, can suppress what you have learned, and rebuild the comfortable lies that allowed you to participate in slavery. Or you can use your positions of privilege to work against the system that created you. That choice belongs to you alone." The brothers departed Vail Plantation that same day, traveling north with minimal possessions and uncertain futures. They never returned to Georgia, not for their father's funeral a decade later, not for family emergencies, not for any reason that might have drawn other sons back to their childhood home. They settled in Ohio and established businesses in manufacturing and trade, deliberately choosing industries unrelated to agriculture or plantation economics. The brothers maintained contact with each other throughout their lives, bound by shared trauma that no one else could fully understand, but they spoke rarely about their months of captivity, even among themselves. The experience had marked them too deeply for casual discussion, had transformed them too completely to be processed into comfortable narrative. James, the eldest, became known in Ohio business circles as unusually progressive on labor issues, treating his factory workers with fairness that his peers considered economically irrational. He never married, never had children, and spent his final years funding schools for formerly enslaved people in Cincinnati. He died in 1879, and his obituary described him as a generous philanthropist whose past remained mysterious even to close associates. Edward practiced law in Cleveland and became quietly active in defending fugitive enslaved people who had escaped to Ohio via underground railroad networks. He used his legal education to challenge the fugitive slave, act in cases that rarely succeeded, but that created procedural obstacles for slave catchers operating in free states. He married late in life, had 2 daughters, and insisted they be educated to the same standard as any son would have been, a position that his wife's family considered radical. Thomas, the youngest, had been changed most profoundly by his conversations with Elizabeth during captivity. He maintained correspondence with her for years after gaining his freedom, sending money regularly and eventually facilitating her own escape to Pennsylvania in 1856. He never married, devoted his resources to abolition work, and wrote extensively in private journals that his executors were instructed to destroy upon his death. Those instructions were not followed, and Thomas's journals, discovered in a Cincinnati library archive in 2003, provided historians with detailed first-hand accounts of Malachi, Brown's program, and its psychological impact. Harrison Vail continued operating his plantation until 1858, but the estate's character changed fundamentally during those years. He reduced his enslaved population from 240 to 120, selling off sections of the plantation and transitioning to less labor-intensive crops. He granted freedom papers to 50 enslaved people over 5 years, as his agreement with Malachi required, and he quietly facilitated dozens of additional escapes by deliberately failing to maintain security measures that might have prevented them. His advocacy for limited reforms in Georgia's slave codes produced mixed results. He successfully influenced several local planters to modify their family separation policies, and he provided testimony in legislative sessions, arguing that certain breeding program practices created security vulnerabilities. But larger structural reforms never materialized. The Georgia political establishment remained too invested in maintaining slavery without constraints, and Harrison's arguments were dismissed by most legislators as dangerously weak. His social standing declined significantly during this period. Other plantation owners viewed him with suspicion, uncertain whether his advocacy for reforms indicated genuine concerns about security or revealed sympathies that bordered on abolition. Business relationships that had once been reliable became strained, and invitations to social events that had once been automatic ceased arriving. Harrison became increasingly isolated from the planter aristocracy he had once belonged to, living out his final years in a kind of internal exile on his own estate. His wife Margaret remained with him throughout this decline, though her own letters suggest she struggled to reconcile the man she had married with the person he had become. Harrison died in 1868, 3 years after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, having lived long enough to see the entire system he had devoted his life to building destroyed completely. His final will included provisions for the remaining formerly enslaved people at Vail Plantation, though by that point emancipation had already granted them freedom that no longer required his permission. Malachi Brown himself disappeared from official records after 1851. Various accounts suggest he continued working as what documents describe as an itinerant laborer and organizer, moving between plantations across Georgia and South Carolina, speaking with enslaved people about resistance strategies and helping to strengthen the communication networks that facilitated underground railroad operations. Some sources claim he eventually escaped to Canada in the mid-1850s and lived out his remaining years in a formerly enslaved community near Toronto. Others suggest he stayed in the South through the Civil War and worked with Union forces during Reconstruction. No death certificate exists, no grave has been identified, and no definitive record establishes what happened to him. After 1856, he simply faded from documented history, becoming the kind of figure who exists more in whispered stories than official accounts. But his legacy persisted in ways that extended far beyond his own life. The Vail brothers' transformation influenced how they raised their own children and how they used their resources in northern states. The 50 people freed from Vail Plantation established communities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Canada, and their descendants carried forward stories about Malachi Brown's program and its significance. The reforms Harrison Vail advocated, though limited and largely unsuccessful during his lifetime, contributed to debates about slavery's future that intensified throughout the 1850s, and the very existence of Malachi's program, even as a carefully concealed secret known only to those directly involved, served as proof that enslaved people possessed strategic intelligence that matched or exceeded their enslavers. Historical record of what occurred at Vail Plantation in 1851 remained fragmentary for over 140 years. The sealed letters written by the Vail brothers were preserved but unread until 1993. Malachi's documentation, if it ever existed in comprehensive form, has never been recovered. The testimonies of those who participated exist only in scattered fragments, brief mentions in Abolition Society records, and oral histories passed down through families who had reasons to keep the full story concealed. It was not until the 1990s, when historians began systematically cross-referencing plantation records with Underground Railroad documentation and previously sealed family archives, that the scope of what Malachi Brown accomplished became clear. Even now, significant questions remain unanswered. The exact location of the modified building where the Vail brothers were confined has never been definitively identified. The full extent of the communication networks Malachi utilized remains unknown, and the question of whether similar programs were attempted at other plantations, either successfully or unsuccessfully, continues to be debated by scholars. What remains undisputed is that something extraordinary happened at Vail Plantation in 1851, something that challenged every assumption about power, resistance, and the supposedly fixed categories that defined antebellum Southern society. An enslaved man, using only his intelligence and his understanding of the system that oppressed him, succeeded in temporarily reversing power dynamics and forcing those who had benefited from slavery to experience a version of its powerlessness. He created not just fear but education, not just revenge but transformation. He proved that the intelligence plantation owners claimed belonged exclusively to themselves, existed in abundance among the people they had tried to reduce to property. And he demonstrated that even within a system designed to crush resistance through overwhelming force, spaces existed for strategic action that could fundamentally challenge the assumptions. Holding that system together, the question of whether Malachi Brown's actions were justified remains one that historians and ethicists continue to debate. Some argue that any form of captivity, even temporary and educational, replicates the cruelty of slavery and cannot be defended regardless of intent. Others contend that Malachi's program represented sophisticated, psychological resistance that achieved goals physical rebellion could never accomplish, forcing enslavers to confront the humanity of those they had dehumanized. The Vail brothers themselves seemed uncertain about how to judge what had happened to them. Thomas's journals described the experience as simultaneously traumatic and necessary, as suffering that destroyed his previous self, while creating space for something better to emerge. James, in his final years, reportedly told an associate that he had been imprisoned by Malachi Brown and freed by him in the same action, though he declined to elaborate on what that paradox meant. What do you think about Malachi Brown's program? Was his reversal of power justified as education for those who had never experienced powerlessness? Or did forcing the Vail brothers into captivity, even temporarily, perpetuate the very cruelty it aimed to expose? Could the brothers' transformation have been achieved through other means? Or did it require the direct experience of what they had inflicted on others? And perhaps most significantly, what does this story reveal about resistance within systems designed to make resistance impossible? About the forms that justice can take when traditional paths to justice had been systematically closed? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And let's discuss what lessons this buried history holds for understanding power, resistance, and the ongoing work of confronting historical injustice. If this exploration of Malachi, Brown's extraordinary program, has changed how you think about slavery and resistance, share this video with someone who appreciates history that refuses to simplify difficult truths. Subscribe for more stories like this, stories that were deliberately hidden because they threatened powerful families' carefully constructed narratives. Hit that like button to support content that brings buried history into the light where it belongs. And remember that the past is never truly past, that the choices made in 1851 by people like Malachi Brown, the Vail brothers, and countless others whose names we will never know continue to shape the world we inhabit today. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never accept that any story has been told completely until you have heard from those who were meant to remain silent.